Today, we are lucky enough to be with Bill Weihl, the founder and executive director of ClimateVoice, which is on a mission to mobilize the voice of the workforce to urge companies to go all in on climate, both in business practices and policy advocacy. Before ClimateVoice, Bill was the green energy czar at Google, starting back in 2006. And most recently, he spent 6 years at Facebook as the director of sustainability. He's now moved from an insider pioneering corporate sustainability at these individual organizations to an outsider, helping to make a lot of companies level up at the same time. He's doing this by educating and activating students and employees everywhere because employees have the power to make their companies move faster and start using their massive influence, especially in the public policy realm, for climate action. So, Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. Delighted to be here.
Awesome. So, we're going to dive into what a company should be doing on climate in order to be considered a true climate leader, and also get into what listeners, employees, and students can do to help make their companies or future companies leaders in this space. But I'd like to start by taking a step back and hearing more about your climate journey and especially how it started. So, when did you decide to work on climate and why?
I really decided to work on it in 2004. So I'd been hearing about climate as an issue for, I don't know, probably at least 5, maybe 10 years at that point. I'm sure I'm guessing I heard about it in the late 80s, early 90s, but I don't think it hit me as, oh my God, this is a crisis. By 2004, I was reading enough about it and seeing technical articles and articles in the popular press talking about where things could go over 20, 30, 50 years. That
Mm-hmm.
it seemed clear this was something that we needed to address, and it would be a hell of a lot easier to address sooner rather than later. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, 2004 was when I sort of had that real aha moment of now's the time to shift what I was working on, where I was working, and really focus, not just in my personal life, but professionally on climate.
And could you briefly walk us through the rest of your journey? So, how did you get to where you are today?
Well, I started my career in computer science. I was on the faculty at MIT for about 10 years, moved out west on sabbatical, and never moved back east for a whole bunch of reasons. Spent, I guess, a little over 10 years, almost 11 years in a couple different companies doing technology, core technology work, and that got us to 2004, where I was thinking about leaving the job I was in, and really realized that what was occupying all the spare cycles in my brain when I was thinking about stuff, it wasn't some hard problem at work, it was my family and friends, and it was climate. Um, and so I spent about a year on a sort of self-imposed sabbatical slash walkabout, and talked to 150 plus people in that year. Basically using my network and getting connected to other people, and not something that came naturally to me, but something I got better and better at as the year went on.
Mm-hmm.
And really trying to explore, okay, I'm not a climate scientist, I'm not a physicist, I'm not a material scientist, I'm a computer scientist with, at that point I'd had a fair amount of business experience. I was chief technology officer at Akamai the last 2.5 years I was there. So I had both the technology side and really exposure to the business side. So spent a year exploring what could I do. Um, I'm not going to go invent, new solar technology, not unless I went back to school and got an advanced degree in material science and physics and whatever. So what could I do? And I was lucky enough then, after a little more than a year, to land a job at Google, as with the charter to figure out what Google can do about climate. And I was given pretty broad latitude to explore things, and I had to justify them. I had to convince people they were a good idea, but it wasn't, oh, go do this one narrow thing about climate. Was we want to do something really big and meaningful. Go
Nice.
figure it out, which was awesome.
That autonomy must have been really, really nice.
Yeah.
So very cool. And kind of building off that question that you just brought up, what can I do? I think, more and more people are starting to ask this on climate. Uh, and to sort of transition into your work today at ClimateVoice, can you tell us a bit more about what ClimateVoice does and how it works and how you can help people answer that question?
Yeah, well, and let me try to put it in context, because I think a lot of people are asking exactly that question. What can I do? And there are a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people giving answers, and I would not claim to have the answer. Climate is a really big, hard, complicated problem in a lot of ways. Um, but I think one answer to what can I do is it's not one thing. Lots of people have their favorite thing. It's, eat less meat or be vegan, travel less or don't travel, or, go live in the woods. And a lot of those things, when people have one thing they're very passionate about, often involve sacrifice. Don't
Yeah.
do things. And in the end, there may well be lifestyle changes we all need to make. There's no question. But the core of the climate problem is that modern society is built on energy. We use energy to do all sorts of things, to keep ourselves safe and comfortable in our houses, to move ourselves and things around, to make things. Um, and most of the energy we use today is based on, comes from burning fossil fuels. And burning fossil fuels creates all kinds of pollution. And when it comes to climate, the biggest one is carbon dioxide. Um, and so we need to change that. And that is, it's not the only thing we need to do to address climate change, but it is one of the biggest. We use fossil fuels for transportation, for heating, and for cooling, to generate electricity, for electricity broadly. We use them in industrial processes of all sorts. Um, all of that, basically, we need to either stop burning fossil fuels or find a way to capture the CO2 that's created when we burn them and sequester it somewhere. Um, and that's not, to a large extent, just a matter of individual choices. Right. It's great when people can make those individual choices. And I've made lots of them in my own life. I got solar on my house right here in San Francisco. Even with the, iconic San Francisco fog, it does pretty well most of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we only have one car at this point. It's an electric car. Um, so we're doing other things to gradually make our life less energy intensive and less carbon intensive. And I would encourage everyone who can to do that wherever they can. Minimizing your own impact is a really good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of things that individuals don't have control over. If you use electricity and maybe you live in an apartment building, or a condo, and you don't have control over the roof, or the roof, you live in a tall apartment building, the roof is too small for solar to cover the electricity needs of the building. um, you're buying your electricity from the local utility, and in a lot of places you get what they sell, and that's it. You don't have options. um, and so you can push your utility to allow you to buy solar or wind through them. Um, or you could push for a policy change that basically requires the utility over time to move its entire generating capacity to clean energy.
Yeah.
Transportation, it's great when people like I have buy electric cars or lease electric cars, or ride bicycles more or walk more. But a lot of people live in places where walking or biking are not great options. So we need to change development patterns. That's not just individual choices, that's public policy.
Yeah.
Um, we need to, to make electric vehicles accessible to many more people. We need to build out charging infrastructure. Some of that is, a lot of that will be private investment, but it's going to take public policy to make it happen at the speed we need it to happen.
Right.
So I like to think of the things you can do as being, sort of concentric circles of influence. There's your own life that you can control and make choices in, and you can do a lot there, depending on how much money you have and what the options are where you live. And then there's the city or town or neighborhood you live and work in. You can potentially drive changes there by voting and speaking up at city council or whatever town meetings. Then there's the state you live in. There's the country you live in. Um, People have the ability to drive change at all of those levels. They're all important.
Yeah.
Um, so ClimateVoice, our starting point was realizing that, and we're not alone in this, that lots of individuals and lots of companies are doing great things on climate. They're using clean energy. they're they are, switching to zero emissions vehicles. They're doing things in their own lives, in the company's operations to reduce their impact. Companies are even looking at their supply chains. So they're pushing their suppliers to use clean energy in factories or whatever, which is great. So we're making lots of progress on climate. We're just making it far too slowly. And,
Yeah.
so some people, there's a lot of debate. Should we frame it as we're winning or we're losing? We're winning, but not fast enough. Um, I mean, I was trained as a scientist and engineer, so I get a little bit frustrated at those discussions because in
Yeah.
the end, what matters is what are we doing and what do we need to do differently. We
Yeah.
are winning, but we're winning too slowly. And with climate, that really is kind of the same as losing. If we keep
Yeah.
winning slowly, we're
Exactly.
in deep trouble. To win faster, in addition to all of the great things that individual people and companies are doing, and the innovations that companies and researchers and universities are developing, to move faster, we need public policy that drives the whole market much faster toward the zero carbon future that science says we need. And to get that public policy, that is now not so much a technical problem of what's the right technology or set of technologies that we should be using them. It really is a political problem. It's not even so much a question of what's the right public policy. There are many policies that can drive the changes we need. And often advocates get really locked into battles about, I prefer this policy versus this one. And I think those are really important uh, debates. But the problem we have today is we have too little policy in too few places. And the reason is fundamentally that the fossil fuel industry and their allies, the various think tanks and trade groups, have spent the last 40, 50 years amassing enormous influence in our political process and using it to stymie progress on climate policy. So what we are trying to do with ClimateVoice is and I think you summarize it well. We want major influential companies to go all in on climate. And that means, yes, decarbonize your operations, go net zero, set a science-based target, go 100% clean energy, clean up your supply chain, and use your influence to help counter the negative influence of the fossil fuel industry. Because when you sit on the sidelines, you're letting them win. And that means we're getting public policy too slowly. So it's great if you're net zero, but if you then sit back and say, we did our part, It's too bad the rest of society can't get there. We all have a problem. So we need companies, if they
Yeah.
really care about climate, to step up and use their influence in the public policy process to help counter the negative influence of the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, that is awesome. I think, at least to my mind, so much of the attention goes to cleaning up your own operations, cleaning up your own supply chain. You get more and more companies doing the science-based targets initiative, which is fantastic, and we need all of those. I'm very excited about what you're doing because it's that next level. It shows the next piece of the puzzle, which is the public policy, and it's this arena that has kind of been neglected uh, in the climate sphere as far as corporations go, in terms of being on the right side of it, trying to advocate for climate positive policies to match up against this massive fossil fuel industry. Um, could you please get into a little bit more of the details there of, I guess, who these associations are or trade groups, so employees can figure out, oh, like my company is a part of this trade group. I need to flag this. Or so I guess I wanted to learn more about who the worst offenders are, and then also just kind of high level. I know you just started a campaign for the big
Yep.
five in tech, trying to get them to put more money into this. And I know, just because I've been scouring your amazing resources, quick shout out, folks should absolutely check out the resources on climatevoice.org because it's a gold mine. um, but I saw that currently the pro climate people are being outspent by the fossil fuel lobby 10 to 1 when it comes to advocating. And I'm wondering, like, the campaign you have is asking the big five in tech to put one out of every five lobbying dollars towards pro climate policies. And I'm wondering, does that level the playing field? Does that make pro climate outweigh the fossil fuel industry? Like, where does that take us, and how much
Yeah,
more do
well,
we
so a
need to go?
couple things. First, in terms of what people can do, I sort of described it as concentric circles. One
Yeah.
one place of influence that most people don't think about is their workplace. So, as an employee, if
Yeah.
you have a job, or as a student, if you someday will be looking for a job, um, for the last year, lots of companies maybe weren't paying that much attention or didn't care quite as much about what their employees thought because they were struggling to stay alive as the economy cratered during COVID. Things are beginning to open up. Hopefully, things actually continue to open up and we don't have a really horrible fourth wave that
Yeah.
causes another major shutdown. But when companies are competing for talent, they care what their employees think, they care what their potential employees think. And so you have the opportunity to influence what companies do in their operations. You can put, if they haven't set a science-based target, you can push them to do that. You can push them to buy clean
Mm-hmm.
energy, and you can push them to actually speak up and weigh in on public policy. And we have seen this happen in other arenas. We were really inspired by what happened over the last decade around LGBT rights in this country, where
Yep.
10 years ago, we had hundreds of companies who were very progressive in their own operations and silent on public policy. And over the course of 2 or 3 years, really, companies moved from near silence on public policy to being very vocal on marriage equality, vocal against the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana, which was discriminating against gay people, against the bathroom bill in North Carolina, which discriminated against trans people, and a whole bunch of other, especially state level bills and policies. Companies helped really shift. They weren't the only factor, but they were a major factor in shifting in the end, the decisions on public policy. We think the same thing can happen on climate, but we need to motivate companies to really step up. And what motivated companies
Yeah.
on LGBT rights was their employees. So that's what we are hoping the movement we are working to create right now around climate is to get employees to really understand how important the policy piece is, how important the voice their companies and influence their companies have can be, and how much of a problem it is that the companies are mostly silent. So to your point about who are the trade associations, so there's a group called Influence Map. If you go to, I think it's influencemap.org, they've done great research over the last half dozen years on how companies and trade associations are using or failing to use their influence on climate in the public policy process, both in influencing the public debate and public discussions of what's in the media around climate, but also then really influencing in the end through lobbying, through campaign contributions, through all the ways in which companies affect public policy, influencing the outcomes in public policy debates. And their research shows pretty clearly that the major fossil fuel companies, especially the big ones in this country, the oil majors, as they're called, have been a really obstructive force on climate policy for certainly the last decade and a half. And that several major trade associations, the oil industry trade associations like the American Petroleum Institute, have been very closely aligned with the fossil fuel industry, but also big cross-sector trade associations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have been mostly obstructionist on climate policy. The National Association of Manufacturers, which covers manufacturing broadly, but across a wide range of sectors, has also been a pretty negative, obstructive force on climate, according to their research. And lots of companies, not just fossil fuel companies, are members of the US Chamber or members of the National Association of Manufacturers. And they might not know what those organizations are doing in their name on climate, or they know but are staying silent, or they speak up but they don't push all that hard. But in the end, those organizations speak on behalf of thousands, tens of thousands of companies, and they have a lot of influence politically. They put a lot into campaign contributions through their political action committees. They lobby extensively. They spend enormous amounts of money on lobbying. So they have influence, they use it. And when companies who are members let those organizations speak on their behalf, they are contributing to the problem. The stat you cited, an academic, a researcher named Robert Bruhl, has been looking at how much money has been spent on lobbying on climate by various sectors. And the 10 to 1 stat was, I think, from the period 2000 to 2016, where the fossil fuel industry spent 10x what the pro-climate action advocates spent. And that means, companies like solar companies, wind companies, and so on, but also NGOs like the Sierra Club or Greenpeace or whoever. All pro-climate advocacy was 1/10 of what the fossil fuel companies spent in that period. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was a lot of money. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands or millions. We're talking about, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars in that period. So clearly, money matters, and it matters in the form of campaign contributions. It matters in the form of, do your lobbyists show up on Capitol Hill or in Sacramento or in Boston or in Columbus, Ohio, in state capitals? And do they show up and push hard on lawmakers to enact really meaningful science-based climate policies? It matters, companies have influence beyond just money and those horns. When a company chooses to locate a new factory or data center or major warehouse and distribution center in a state, in a congressperson's district, um, that's a real benefit to that state and that congressperson. They get economic development. The congressperson can say, look, I brought jobs to my district. So they can use that decision point, I'm choosing where to locate a new facility, to extract all sorts of concessions. You might remember Amazon's search for their second headquarters, HQ2, which is this, beauty contest where, dozens, maybe hundreds of municipalities submitted proposals, bids to try to attract them, offering tax breaks and infrastructure upgrades, all sorts of things to get Amazon to dump 25,000, 50,000 jobs in their city, their town.
Right. Yep.
Amazon could have said, we want to locate in a place where the political leadership is committed to real, meaningful, science-aligned climate action, and we're going to give strong preference to cities and states where that's true. They didn't. Right? They wanted places that had good transportation because they were going to create a lot of jobs, and they didn't want their employees to be stuck in several hour commutes, which is important for climate. But they were focused on the things that mattered to them, not on the things that mattered to the whole region and to society as a whole. That, to my mind, is a real missed opportunity. And so it's all of these companies, as they grow, as they decide which offices to expand, which data centers and factories to expand, where to put new facilities, they could be using that influence to shift where those regions are on climate, both what they're doing locally in those regions, but also what their elected representatives are doing in Washington for the country as a whole. Right.
Yeah.
In terms of money, I think over the last several years, big tech, the five big US tech companies, Apple, Amazon, Google / Alphabet, Facebook, and Microsoft, they've been spending collectively, according to the federal lobbying disclosures, at the federal level, they've been spending collectively among the five of them, I think about $60 to $70 million a year. It went up a bit in the last year. We'll see what happens over the next couple of years, but what they've been spending on lobbying has been growing. And it has been mostly focused on things that really matter to their core business. So taxes, immigration, trade, intellectual property, antitrust these days, I think, for several of them, technology policy broadly. It has mostly not been on things that are really important for climate, with a few exceptions. They all use lots of electricity. So they are all increasingly weighing in on electricity-related policies, including ones that will help green the grid as a whole. And that's awesome.
Nice.
But we need them weighing in on climate policy broadly. Things that will clean up the entire transportation system, that will clean up buildings, that will clean up industry and agriculture.
Every sector.
There are a lot of policies that, as I said before, it's not that there's one policy they should all advocate for. There's lots of debate about the details of the policies, but we have a good understanding of what we need to do to decarbonize, 60 to 80% of what needs to be done. We have a good idea of what kinds of policies could drive that. What we need is for companies to stand up and say, this really matters to us. It's going to affect, who we make campaign contributions to. It's going to affect where we choose to invest to grow our business and create jobs and economic activity. And we want elected officials in all those regions to commit to real science-based policy that will drive decarbonization at the speed and scale that's needed, and ideally that will really be focused on justice and equity, because in the end,
Hmm.
sort of technocratic approach that doesn't address some of the historical inequities and environmental injustices, and that perpetuates them, um, I think will be problematic both morally but also politically. It's going to be really hard to muster the political coalition needed to pass things if we don't meet the concerns of people who really care about those issues.
Yeah. And it's just the right thing to do. So there's so much in there. I feel like I could have you on for 3 hours here and learn a ton. There's a couple things that I just want to reiterate. It sounds like what is missing at most organizations is kind of this next level of thinking, of looking at all of your policy and investment decisions through this climate lens. And these things that you typically wouldn't think of as being climate related, but it's such a pervasive issue and touches so many different things that pretty much everything is climate related. Um, and so I'm wondering, if you are an employee at a company and say you, I'm just going to use this example because I just read it in the last week or two. Maybe it was before that, but Emily Atkin has this awesome
Yep,
newsletter called
love
Heated,
it.
and she called out, yeah, it's amazing. She's fantastic. She called out companies that were donating to the Senate candidates in Georgia back in January, and was pointing out this discrepancy between, you know, the one that comes to mind is Microsoft, who's this supposed climate leader, and they are doing a lot of fantastic stuff. But they were donating to campaigns of people who had no interest in moving climate policy forward, and most likely were going to try to prevent anything from happening or even move it backward. And so, say you're an employee who discovers something like that. You work at Microsoft. You're like, okay, that's pretty messed up. How do you like? What advice do you have for folks to start having these conversations with coworkers and also start organizing internally to really, you know, change the direction of the ship here and become the best climate leader that that company can be? What are the first steps in strategy or advice? What do you think of that's
Well,
useful?
first, I think that's a great example, and I think Emily Atkin has been doing a great job of shining a spotlight on what's called hypocrisy. It is at some level,
Yeah,
and it's complicity. It may be unintentional hypocrisy, but once it's been called out, when companies continue to say no, they say we donate to both sides. We don't agree with everything that any trade group we're part of or anyone we donate to does, but we feel it's important to contribute to be part of it and so on. At a certain point, that really is complicity. And I think on climate, on voting rights, we've seen this discussion recently around the um, Georgia seems to keep coming up. The
yeah,
voting restrictions that have been passed in Georgia, where several companies, since they passed, have now come out and made really strong statements. Um, it
yeah,
would have been nice if they had made those statements both publicly and privately while the bills were being debated and helped stop them from passing. But as far as I can tell, they didn't. They certainly didn't, threaten to, Microsoft, I think, is expanding in Georgia, building a major presence. They could have gone to Georgia and said, if you restrict voting rights in this way, we will take our business elsewhere. I mean, Coca-Cola and Delta are headquartered there. Their major presence, it seems unlikely they would just up and leave. So they're making strong statements now. It would have been nice if they made them before. But again, they do have influence They haven't used it like they really mean it yet. And that's what we need on climate as well. We need companies, you put it well, every major decision they're making, they should be looking at not just through a financial lens for their own bottom line, but through a climate lens, and not just the climate lens for their own operations, but for society.
Yeah.
And they are mostly not doing that. And then they need to lobby like they mean it. So they need, if an elected official votes the wrong way, there have to be consequences. Stop donating to them. Stop expanding in their district or their state. And mostly companies are not doing that yet today. So then, what can employees do? I think one answer is it depends. Maybe that's my former academic self coming out. It depends on the company and the culture and how much they tolerate, let's call it dissent or activism, or employees raising issues and pushing for the company to be better. I encourage employees to frame it not as sort of finger wagging, telling your employer you suck, but rather constructively, assuming you like your job and you like the company and you like the work it's doing, you think that broadly it is a good place to work and it's doing good in the world. Part of your job should be making it a better company. And I think approaching it from that frame is a great way to then talk about it with other employees, your peers around the company, but also with executives. And I think the first place to start is when we're all back in offices someday, and you're having lunch, or when you're on Zoom or whatever your favorite platform is, or maybe even just the phone, catching up with colleagues, talking about what you're thinking about, what's going on in your lives, and raise the issue of hey, have you seen what's happening in Washington right now around climate? And it seems like our company is kind of sitting on the sidelines. What do you guys think? Here's what I think, and start talking about it, raising the issue, helping educate your fellow employees. That's really step one, because I think you said before,
Yeah.
most people, and I think you're right, most people, when they think about what companies should do on climate, they think about clean up your own backyard, right? And too much when they think about what they can or should do, they think about cleaning up their own backyard. Put solar in your house. Really important, not enough. So it's I've described it. It's climate improv, right? It's yes and. So yes, do what you can personally and what your company can do itself, and look to all the ways in which you can influence the systemic um, rules and policies that drive where the entire economy goes. But we need to
Yeah.
educate people to get them out of this individualistic mindset and thinking about what needs to happen systemically, what needs to change, and what influence do they and their company have on that. So step one is talk to other people. Step two, I would say, so you mentioned earlier the campaign we just launched. So right now we're very beginning of April, we launched a campaign focused on the big five US tech companies. The campaign's called One in Five. We're asking them to devote this year, because this is a really pivotal year for climate policy in the US, devote 1 in 5 of their lobbying dollars to climate aimed at a just transition that keeps us below 1.5 degrees of warming. And that really means elevating climate to be one of their top advocacy policy priorities. If they're not putting money into it, it's not a priority. If it's a priority, they're putting money into it. And money is the thing everyone
Yeah.
knows how to measure. So that's why we're focused on that. But we also want them to use whatever other forms of influence they have. Like, where are you going to locate that next office, data center, factory, whatever? Um,
Right.
so, um, uh, so I think one of the things that employees can do then is go sign the petition at 1in5for1.5.org or Google 1in5. Go to climatevoice.org. There's a
Yep.
big link to the 1in5 petition.
I could
That
I
would
could
be
link to that in
awesome.
the show notes for sure.
They can also sign the Climate Voice pledge, which is Climate Voice is as an organization is focused broadly on getting companies to step up. The 1in5 campaign is focused on big tech, but we're looking for signatures for the 1in5 petition and the broader Climate Voice pledge. We particularly want people who work in tech to sign the petition, and students who are people that the companies might want to hire someday to sign, but we want everybody to sign. I mean, the more we have their employees and the students they want to hire signing, I think that will have particular influence on the companies, but also the total number of signatures really matters, and it'll matter in terms of how much attention we can get in the press, which will affect the companies and
Yep.
so on. So sign the damn petition, and spread the word. Among your colleagues, if you're employed somewhere, among your fellow students, if you're a student, whichever you are, if you've got friends who are students but you're working, if you've got friends who are employees somewhere but you're a student, spread the word through social media, through one-on-one or group interactions, through email, whatever, spread the word. And talk about this with, if you're at a company with fellow employees, and think about, in the context of your company, what are ways in which you could then raise it with executives who might be in a decision-making position.
Mm-hmm.
Does your company have, sort of town halls, all hands, where employees have the opportunity to ask questions? If so, raise questions. Again, I would recommend doing it as constructively as possible. Some people tend to be more combative and antagonistic, and if that's your style, whatever works for you. But we're not asking people to put their jobs at risk. We're asking them to help make their employers better. And one of the arguments that I think people can make is, look, this is where the world is going. We have to address climate. We all know that. This is going to happen. The question is when. And the longer we wait, the more painful it's going to be for everybody, both in terms of the negative consequences of climate change, but also in terms of how radical the policies, how stringent the policies are going to need to be to get us where we need to go. Because the longer we wait, the harder that it's going to be, the steeper the decarbonization path we need to be on. And that's going to make policies, sort of harder for the transition's going to be harder. So sooner is better. Young people, I think, more and more are on board with, it is time to really, for us all to go all in on climate and address this. And so companies that continue to kind of play both sides and say, yeah, we care, but we're going to be silent on this, or we're going to say some nice things, but not really lobby like we mean it, I think they will increasingly find over the next couple of years that it gets harder to hire, because there are some companies in tech. Microsoft, honestly, has been, according to the Influence Map report, Microsoft and Apple are kind of leading relative to the other big tech companies. But Microsoft, as you pointed out, they donated to climate obstructionists in Georgia. If those folks had won, nothing on climate was going to get through the Senate. So they might have been lobbying for some things, but those contributions, if they actually allowed those candidates to win those runoffs, would have doomed climate legislation at the national level for the next at least 2, maybe 4 years. So they're playing both sides. That has to stop. You can't play both sides on voting rights. And I think at this point, you can't play both sides on climate. And young people, I think, will increasingly be less satisfied with companies that do that. And they do have alternatives, So Apple, I think, has been a little less vocal than Microsoft, but has not done as much negative stuff. So, I think that's why they're really up there, kind of neck and neck. Salesforce in the tech
Right.
sector has been increasingly vocal and increasingly clear about how vital climate and climate policy is. Outside the tech sector, you've got companies like Unilever or Mars, which have been very, very vocal, and they're both enormous companies. Smaller companies like Patagonia and Seventh Generation and Ben & Jerry's also have been increasingly vocal. So there are places that young people could go find jobs that aren't, say, the big five tech companies or some other big companies, but are much better on climate policy. It's time for all those companies, if they really care about climate, to go all in and speak up and lobby like they mean it.
Yeah. So I have a more tactical question for you, maybe getting into the weeds a little here. Let's say someone loves what they're hearing right now and they go to your site, they sign the pledge. They share it with their coworkers. More people are signing this pledge at this company. What then does ClimateVoice do with these signatures? And are you working with the employees at all? Like, where does it go from
So
there?
we have been in touch for several months with a few employees at each of the big tech companies, partly because we wanted their feedback on, is this something that resonates with you? Is it something you'd be willing to evangelize with your fellow employees? Is it something you think could move the executives? So one thing people can do then is work to, as I said, talk with other employees, find a core group that is willing to then speak up internally. You can also reach out to us, and we can give you information that you can then use internally to help make the case with executives. What we are doing with the signatures, we are talking to executives, the sustainability leaders, the leaders of the public policy and government affairs teams. We've been talking to them for a couple of months, telling them that this campaign is coming, giving them the chance to start to think about how they might want to shift even before we started the campaign. But we will be in touch with them at least every few weeks, letting them know how many signatures, what we are hearing on the outside. And it's not just us. There are now at least a dozen other major NGOs who all want to see companies and are calling very clearly for companies to step up on public policy. We are the main one right now that is really trying to organize employees and students to start to push and encourage companies to do that. Others are, you could say others are more providing the carrots and the encouragement and the, if you want to engage as a company, here's a group that works with companies that can help you go lobby together with other companies. We're providing more of the, call it the sticks and the pressure that other organizations are not. We will not release people's names publicly. So we're not going to tell Apple, here's the list of 2,000 employees who signed. The only reason for Apple, that Apple would want or need those names would be to then retaliate. So they don't need the names, they need the numbers. And then we are encouraging people, as they feel comfortable, to speak up internally to let executives know this matters.
Yeah, awesome. So my next question might be a little premature. I'm not totally sure. I know you guys are very new still. I think you started
We started a year ago, February.
Somewhere around there.
Correct. and the 1 in 5
February.
campaign
Yeah,
launched on March 31st of this year.
very fresh. Um, so my question is around, do you measure how many people join in and speak up at a corporation before they end up taking action? And I'm curious about this kind of stemming from the 3.5% rule,
Mm-hmm.
if you've heard of that. Um, and so I guess just in your experience, does that seem applicable for driving change at the corporate level? Like that rule applies to the national level? Is it that small amount of people that can really make a corporation move and take big steps in the right direction?
We don't have great data on that yet, I would say.
Still early, yeah.
What we observed in the case of, for example, the battles in Indiana around REFRA, or in North Carolina around the bathroom bill, is that a
Mm-hmm.
very small number of employees spoke up and were quite vocal. And it was clear there were, a medium number of other employees who cared, either because they were also LGBT or they were allies. But there were, a couple dozen maybe who were, or even less, at least that I saw inside Facebook, and talking to folks at other companies. I think it was similar. There wasn't many who raised the issue, and executives, I think, understood that there was a larger group of employees who cared and could be activated. And they also understood that the, sort of the zeitgeist had shifted among young people, and that for people in college who the company might want to be hiring over the next few years, that this issue was just a kind of no-brainer civil rights issue, and that continuing
Yeah.
to sit on the sidelines would be seen as, and easily painted as, being complicit and being on the wrong side, not just neutral, but really on the wrong side. And they didn't want to take the risk that it would make, retention somewhat harder, because some people would get sufficiently upset to leave, but will also make hiring potentially a lot harder. So it didn't take many people to make that case. I think with climate, it remains to be seen how many. Is it, a couple dozen really speaking up, and a couple dozen people in a corporation with 100,000 employees is a really small percentage, right? Or is it
Yeah,
1,000 or
tiny.
5,000? We don't know. Um, I don't think it requires half the employees. I think that it is clear based on sort of polling of the public, and especially when you break it out by age range, it's clear that younger people who represent the talent pool these companies draw from for their growth, they really care about climate. And I think as we help get them educated on the role of policy and the role of companies in policy, that it's going to be increasingly clear to them that companies who are silent or mostly silent are being complicit, and that's not okay. And so I think, if we get a few dozen employees speaking up and a few hundred or a few thousand signing a petition, that is enough to really begin to move the companies. And we'll have to then see what happens. How much do they step up? How much do they speak up? How much pressure do we need to keep putting on them to, continue to step up more and more? This is, as I said, a really pivotal year compared
Yeah.
to the last several years. A door has opened in Washington for national policy. Um, it's on all of us who care about it to do everything we can to kick that door open as wide as we can and help get as much through as we can. Um, Biden has put
Yeah.
forward, part one of his major infrastructure plan. It's got a lot of great stuff in there on climate. It's not enough, but we're not going to get everything done at once. It's a lot, and it is a really good step. We need companies, the big tech companies and others, to now really stand up and help make those policies happen this year. and it is going to be a battle in Congress, especially in the Senate.
That it is. I'm hopeful that that ClimateVoice really helps push these companies to, maybe tip the scale a little bit more than it otherwise would and get some more stuff passed. So I know we're coming up on an hour here, and this has been absolutely amazing so far. Thank you for sharing all of this, all these insights with us. I just have a handful of wrap up
Sure.
questions before you go. So the first is, what book or books do you recommend or gift to people the most? It can be, about climate, about this stuff, or just in general.
The one I've been reading, I'm not quite through it, but I've been reading lately, is Michael Mann's most recent book, The New Climate War. It is awesome. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
Too much in the climate world, we danced around the war, the battle that's been going on. And the other side knows
Yeah.
it's in a war. It's acting like it's in a war. In our side, too much talks about, we want bipartisanship and we want this and that. And we're not fighting, or not enough of us
Yeah.
are. And so I would, people want to understand what's been going on for years and how the rhetoric of those who are trying to preserve the status quo, how it has shifted from flat out denial to what Michael Mann calls inactivism. They're pushing delay and
Yep.
inaction now, and they're doing a range of things that that tend to create inaction. Um, and so I would say that's number one on my list. If you want to understand what the root of the problem is, that I would start there.
Nice. That's awesome. That is on my list. I haven't started it yet, but he is good. Um, Next question is, if listeners want to learn more or follow your work, where do you recommend they go, and what should they do?
ClimateVoice.org. Thank you for for your praise. We've got a bunch of resources on there now, including some sort of tip sheets and guides for employees and for students, what they can do to start to make clear to either the executives of the company where they work or places that they might be interviewing or exploring, make clear that they really care and that this is something that will ultimately affect where they choose to work. We have a policy guide for business leaders, which um, really tries to make the case about why companies need to step up and lobby. So it's really about the whole theory of change, if you will, um,
Yeah.
and how they can exercise their influence on policy, and then the kinds of policies, not the single silver bullet policy, but the kinds of policies they need to lobby on. We're in the process of updating and revising that policy guide now. It should be out probably by Earth Day. But the old version's great. The new version will be a little more timely and better, but either way. So in terms of learning about what we're doing, I'd go to climatevoice.org. 1in5for1.5.org. I'll let you put the link on the website so I don't have to explain where the numerals are and where
Mm-hmm.
it's all spelled out. For the 1 in 5 campaign, that's the thing that is really most urgent and timely right now. I encourage people to go there,
Yep.
sign the petition, and spread the word.
Awesome. Awesome. Any other calls to action? I know you just gave us a few there, but are there any others that you want to
Yeah, I
touch
think
upon?
I would just reiterate: spread the word, talk to your friends, talk to your colleagues, um, make clear that this is such a pivotal year and policy really matters. And so you need to vote,
Yeah.
but we're not in an election right now. So now it's about what levers of influence do any of you have to influence the policy outcomes. And that's writing and calling elected representatives, but it is also pushing your employer or potential employer, if you're a student, to use its influence. And companies have a lot of influence. It's time for them to step up.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to tie something together here that you mentioned earlier, thinking about individual action and seeing it as these concentric circles of going from beyond your personal footprint and, doing stuff around your house, to thinking of how you can change the system, and whether that be at your workplace or in your state, country, whatever it may be. And it seems to me that these concentric circles also apply to corporations, looking beyond just cleaning up their own backyard and now looking at what the other levers of influence are that they have and that they're not
Absolutely.
exercising right now, and starting to look at this very holistically.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the ways that when I was at Facebook, for example, that we really thought about. And I was, that there's our own operations, there's our supply chain, there's local,
Yep.
Cities or towns where we're based, and then there are the broader, sort of communities and global community. Um, it was hard from the inside to get the company to really engage go all the way in on those outer circles.
Right.
And that's something that I think that employees and students can help really push companies to do. There are hundreds of companies now setting science-based targets and buying clean energy and cleaning up those inner circles in their supply chain even. But we don't have time for another 5 or 10 years of them slowly inching their way outward. This year and next, we need them to just go all in.
100%. Well, awesome. Any final messages for folks or key takeaways you want to share before we part ways?
This is the year, and there are a lot of reasons to hope, but we can't just sit back and wait for it to happen. So dig in, speak up, push your company, and let's make it happen.
Amazing. On that note, thanks so much, Bill, for coming on the show and all the important work that you and the team are doing over at ClimateVoice.
My pleasure. Thank you.